Picture me, if you will, at my desk, scripting the very video that you're about to watch when I see that my friend and colleague Genetically Modified Skeptic has just uploaded a response to the same video as me. I promise I'm not just copying you, Drew, at least not this time anyway. And I have checked to make sure that I'm not stepping on your toes with this video, but of course, a link to GM Skeptic's video is in the description, and I would recommend that you all go and watch it. Ben Shapiro, perhaps at least once the de facto commander-in-chief on the conservative front lines of the culture wars, is a man that you may recognise from such classics as encouraging people who own homes about to be flooded by rising sea levels to simply sell them.
Let's say, for the sake of argument, that all of the water levels around the world rise by, say, 10 feet by the next 100 years, and it puts all the low-lying areas on the coast underwater. You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
To fish, presumably. Who once accused the chairman of The Spectator of being a, quote, lefty, before leaving the interview early in protest of this well-known conservative journalist's left-wing bias.
Why don't you just say that you're on the left? Is this so hard for you? Why can't you just be honest?
And of course, his, shall we say, confusion over what Cardi B was trying to get across by rapping about her wet-ass P-word.
There's something that is going on here that is not biologically normal. And by the way, the song is so unsexy that it frankly sounds like somebody describing what amounts to a serious condition that requires the care of a doctor.
Indeed, for people like Ben, the only person that you should ever be getting on your knees for is a more supernatural kind of daddy. And in fact, he appears to believe that anybody who fails to recognize the existence of some supernatural creator of the universe is suffering from a moral and intellectual shortcoming. Ben recently released, as part of his Debunked series, a video called The Atheist Delusion, an ironic reference, of course, to Richard Dawkins' famous book of 2006. How original. So, let's take a look at why Ben thinks that if you, as I, don't believe in God, you've got some intellectual work ahead of you.
Listen, there's no way to blame people who don't believe in God because they've experienced enormous amounts of personal pain. God is apart from human beings, and if we understood the mind of God, then we would be like God in his totality, which we are not. That does not mean that you're not feeling the pain that you are feeling. It doesn't mean you don't have a right to feel angry at God. But understand that the struggle with God is a part of religion itself. Being a religious believer is the consistent struggle with the logic of the universe, and that seems to me a deeper and more fulfilling struggle than simply pretending the universe has no meaning at all.
Being a religious believer is the consistent struggle with the logic of the universe. And that seems to Ben, quote, a more fulfilling struggle than simply pretending that the universe has no meaning at all. Why would being a religious believer be a, quote, struggle with the logic of the universe? As if the logic of the universe doesn't naturally point to God, and this is instead something we have to effort to make consistent with our observations of the universe. How much suffering it contains, how absent God constantly appears to be from it. Ben has already done some of the work for the atheist in pointing out that being religious is a struggle. And not just because of the social implications or whatever, but because of the very, quote, logic of the universe, the struggle against which Ben says is integral to religious belief. But also consider that Ben said he finds this a, quote, deeper and more fulfilling struggle than simply pretending the universe has no meaning at all. It may well be deeper and more meaningful or fulfilling to you, Ben, but that of course works in favor of the atheist too. It implies that at least part of the reason why you choose theism over atheism is not because of reason or argument, but simply because you find it more meaningful and deeper. Of course, this is exactly what the atheist thinks accounts for religious belief in the first place. Man's desperate effort to invent purpose and meaning where it doesn't exist, to make themselves feel better about being stuck in the human condition. Thanks for admitting it, I guess. Ben then assumes that atheism and nihilism are the same thing by saying that the opposite of being a religious believer is asserting that the universe has no meaning at all. Now, it may well be a defensible position that atheism should entail nihilism, but Ben's sort of smuggled in the meaninglessness there by conflating the two as if they're the same thing. But don't worry, because bizarrely, Ben also implies that nihilists are only pretending to be nihilists. For him, struggling with the logic of the universe, whatever that even means, is better than, quote, pretending that the universe has no meaning.
Simply pretending the universe has no meaning at all.
This suggests, of course, that a person who doesn't adopt theism is merely pretending to be an atheist or a nihilist, and it smacks of a patronizing, "I know that deep down you do actually believe in God," while suggesting that atheists, like myself, are somehow pretending, or at least engaging in self-denial. Think about it, how offensive would it be if I said, atheism is just the result of struggling with the logic of the universe, which is far more deep and meaningful than simply pretending that God exists. Not only would that misrepresent your position, Ben, but it would also suggest that you're lying, at least to yourself, and potentially to others, by only pretending to believe what you claim to believe. Is that what you're trying to accuse atheists of doing?
God, according to atheists, is an unnecessary hypothesis. The universe just is. We just are. There's no reason to search for a creator.
Of course there's reason to search for a creator. I mean, Ben, I'm essentially a professional atheist at this point, and my entire career has been an exercise in searching for a creator of the universe. An atheist is simply a person who is yet to find such a being, not someone who thinks that it's not worth searching. Indeed, many atheists are atheists precisely because they started searching for the God that they'd been told penetrates the entire universe, and found absolute radio silence in response to their prayers, and hardly any persuasive force in the arguments used to support his existence.
There's no reason to search for a creator, to posit that he cares about us, to suggest that there is some higher power that bridges the gap from what is to how things ought to be.
Trying to ground ethics in descriptive scientific facts about the universe, or getting an ought from an is famously one of the greatest challenges of philosophy. Ben's correct that this is an extremely difficult thing to do on atheism, perhaps even impossible. But why would believing in God make the problem any easier? David Hume is famously credited as a popularizer of the is-ought problem. He points out that to say something like, "It is the case that racism causes suffering, therefore we ought not be racists," is an invalid inference. It doesn't follow. You can't derive an ought from an is alone. You need an extra premise, something like, "We ought not cause suffering." Now the argument is valid, but as you can see, we're not getting an ought from an is anymore, but just an ought from another ought. So no matter how many facts we have about the way the universe is, we'll never be able to derive how we ought to behave. Now, Ben is suggesting that God can somehow solve this problem and allow us to derive an ought from an is. But why? Suppose we say something like, "It is the case that God forbids murder, therefore we ought not murder." This too is invalid. We can't derive an ought from an is, so we need to inject an extra premise, like, "We ought not do what God forbids." Now the argument's valid, but again we're just getting an ought from an ought, still not an ought from an is. You'll never be able to justify these extra ought premises by using is premises alone, even if the is premises are about God. You always have to assume an ought from the outset. Now, if I'm not allowed to do that with something like avoiding suffering, then why should you be allowed to do it with something like following God's commands?
Atheism often claims that religion corrupts mankind.
If you want to make good people do wicked things, you'll need religion.
That the notion of a God blinds men to the truths around them. That science is directly opposed to the idea of a creator.
Do you give them an A at least for trying to reconcile faith and reason?
I don't think they're reconcilable.
None of these things are true.
That was a little bit unfair. You used that clip of Neil deGrasse Tyson to make it seem like he was saying that, quote, "Science is directly opposed to the idea of a creator."
That science is directly opposed to the idea of a creator.
But if you watch the full interview, Neil is clearly saying that science is opposed specifically to biblical fundamentalism. Things like believing that the earth was created in 6 days. Not that it's opposed to belief in God generally. In fact, he specifically says that it's perfectly possible to be a religious believer whilst accepting the findings of modern science, and that it's the fundamentalists with whom science has a problem.
And so the educated religious people are perfectly fine with that. It's the fundamentalists who want to say that the Bible is the literal truth of God, and want to see the Bible as a science textbook, who are knocking on the science doors of the schools trying to put that content in the science. enlightened religious people are not behaving that way. They're saying, yes, science is cool, we're good with that.
Now listen again to what Ben implied Neil was trying to argue.
That science is directly opposed to the idea of a creator.
Which I hope you can see is not what Neil was saying at all.
Let's begin with the idea that God is an unnecessary hypothesis. It's difficult to imagine an argument in which God is utterly unnecessary. That is because all human logic is rooted in certain basic assumptions about the nature of the world and about reason that are completely unmoored from the dictates of evolutionary biology. First, we make claims of objective truth, truth that exists independent of human minds. How does such truth exist? Based on the dictates of evolutionary biology, our ability to comprehend a truth should really be no more than our ability to think whatever is most evolutionarily beneficial for us and our genetic descendants. But we don't believe that we think 2 + 2 = 4 because it's evolutionarily beneficial. We believe 2 + 2 = 4 always and everywhere because it's true. And that bespeaks a truth beyond the merely material.
Ben's just presented an argument attributed to Alvin Plantinga called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. If there is no God and human beings simply evolved blindly by natural selection, then how can we trust our very ability to reason, to add 2 and 2 and get 4? Think about it. What does natural selection select for? Well, it selects for survivability. It doesn't select for truth. Now, of course, it could just coincidentally be the case that whatever's beneficial for our survival to believe also just happens to be true, but this seems incredibly unlikely, at least considering how many true things we claim to know and how much room there is for such a process of reasoning to go wrong. Now, if we are entirely evolved creatures, then our reasoning faculty is evolved too, which means that our reasoning faculty evolved not to tell us what's true, but to tell us things that make us more likely to survive. So when my reasoning tells me 2 + 2 = 4, how can I know that this is true and not simply beneficial to believe for my survival? Well, if we're atheists who believe that we evolved by natural selection, we can't know this at all. But of course, if there's some kind of intelligent creator overseeing our evolution, then he can design the process such that it does result in our reasoning faculties being accurate to truth, meaning that we can trust our reason. So, the argument goes, the only way that we can trust our very ability to reason is to assume that our minds were purposefully designed by a creator. For what it's worth, I think this is a wonderful argument, characteristic of Plantinga's genius. Truly, it deserves a video of its own, and it may well get one. But what I'll say here is this. What kind of video are we watching right now? We're watching Ben Shapiro provide a number of reasonable arguments that God exists and that atheism is false. He's about to go on to provide a number of other reasonable arguments throughout the video. But he begins by saying that our very ability to trust reason in the first place must assume God's existence. Without God, we can't trust our reasoning faculty as sensitive to truth at all. But can't you see how this completely undermines the rest of the entire video and condemns it to be circular? Indeed, saying that we have to assume God's existence to trust reason makes all philosophy of religion completely circular. Why do I say this? Well, suppose we want to make an argument for God's existence. These arguments are supposed to show us that we can use reason to establish God's existence, and this is what the rest of Ben's video is dedicated to trying to do. The problem is that if we're going to use reason to establish God's existence, then we of course need to trust our reasoning faculties in order to make the arguments work. But Ben's just told us that in order to trust reason, we need to assume God's existence. So before we can even use reason to argue for God's existence, we need to assume that God exists. But as you can see, this makes any attempt to prove God's existence using reason entirely circular, because we need to begin with the very conclusion that we're seeking to establish. But the rest of Ben's video consists in him using reason to argue for God's existence. So by saying that we need to assume God in order to use reason in the first place, Ben is seemingly unknowingly begging the question, making literally any other of his arguments entirely circular.
Second, we make claims with regard to morality. But what is morality without a baseline assumption that human beings have inherent worth? Even utilitarian philosophies, the attempt to ignore moral right and wrong in favor of consequentialist outcomes, the greatest good for the greatest number, for example, has to assume something about what makes an outcome good or bad.
The needs of the many outweigh
the needs of the few.
You can't determine the greatest good for the greatest number without determining the greatest good. And that has moral premises that have to be assumed. The belief in any moral oughts require us to believe unprovable truths that must descend from outside ourselves.
So we already just covered the is-ought problem a moment ago, but here we have a more detailed moral argument for God's existence. Ben says that most of us assume that certain things are right and wrong, and that morality exists. But, he asks,
what is morality without a baseline assumption that human beings have inherent worth?
Though I do wish that he'd included non-human animals as having worth too, Ben's right. In order to have morality, we need to have at least one basic moral assumption. Remember, if all we have is non-moral facts about the universe, just a bunch of is statements, we'll never be able to get an ought. So Ben correctly states that morality has to assume some moral premise, such as that we ought respect the worth of human beings. As long as we assume this, we can start deriving moral facts. But the problem is grounding that moral assumption. Why is it that human beings have inherent worth? Notice that Ben didn't provide an answer to this at all, let alone proving that it can only be grounded in God, opting instead to rather mystically say,
the belief in any moral oughts require us to believe unprovable truths that must descend from outside ourselves.
If the moral truths are unprovable, Ben, then how can you know that they must be grounded in God? You're suggesting on the one hand that our basic moral assumptions can't be proven, but on the other that they can be vindicated by God's existence. Why? If God commanding something proves that it's moral, then these aren't unprovable truths at all. But you say that they are unprovable, and that they must, quote, descend from outside of ourselves, once again providing absolutely no proof of this, and in fact stating that such a statement can't be proven. If not, then how the hell do you know that this is the case? I recently recorded a podcast with Joe Schmidt in which we went into some more detail on the moral argument and whether introducing God into the picture actually helps us ground ethics at all. So if you're interested in some more detail on this, you can watch that and I'll put a link in the description.
Third, we live as though we believe in choice, as though we are capable of making decisions in some way based on our own will. What in materialism would allow for such choice? How would such choice come about? If we're just balls of meat wandering around in space, how exactly do we make choices? God is necessary for these thoughts, or at least the possibility of God. Trash God altogether, and you can't explain why you would believe in objective truth, or morality, or even your own ability to choose.
I'm beginning to see a trend here. Once again, Ben has detailed one of the great problems of philosophy, and correctly pointed out that it's very difficult to solve if you're an atheist, but failed to see that the problem is equally difficult to solve if you're a theist. If you've watched my videos before, you'll know that I don't believe that free will exists, precisely for at least some of the reasons that Ben has just pointed out. But Ben just simply says, that's why we need God to solve the problem.
How exactly do we make choices? God is necessary for these thoughts.
Without providing a single reason why the existence of God would make the existence of free will any more plausible. If God existed, we'd still be big bags of meat wandering around in a universe that's either determined or contains some randomness, both of which by definition we have no control over. Now you might say that if God exists, then we could have a soul, and maybe free will somehow exists in there. But you can believe in a soul and still be an atheist, and even if we have a soul and the soul determines our actions, we run into the exact same problems as saying that the brain determines our actions. As long as we can't ultimately control what it is that our soul desires, we can't be free. And for more information on why, you can watch my video on free will. I recognize that a lot of you will remain unconvinced, but it's something that requires a little bit more attention. So you can watch my video on free will, and that will explain why I don't believe that it does exist, nor do I believe that it can. So notice the sleight of hand that's going on here. Ben points out an impossible task, such as justifying the existence of free will or getting an ought from an is. He then says, quite correctly, that on atheism, the task is impossible. But it's impossible on theism too. It's as if he said something like, if God doesn't exist, then 2 + 2 can never equal 5. Like, sure, yeah, that's true. But if you're going to imply that God existing would somehow make us able to do this, you have to demonstrate it. And what arguments did Ben give in favor of free will if God exists? None.
As it turns out, there are a bevy of logically consistent arguments offered on behalf of God. Take, for example, the first cause proof advanced by Aristotle as refined by Thomas Aquinas. Edward Feser lays out the argument in his book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. The argument goes something like this. First, change exists in the world, but all change is the actualization of a potential for that change. So if something is changing, it's because there was a potential for that change in the thing. No potential can be actualized unless something already actual actualizes it. So that means that all change is caused by something already actual. This means either there is an infinite regress of actualizers, or there is a purely actual actualizer. This is sort of like the old joke about the philosopher and the turtle. The philosopher is asked, what supports the earth? And he says, a turtle. And somebody says, well, what supports the turtle? And he says, another turtle. So what about that one? He says, it's turtles all the way down. The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle. There has to be one prime cause. That cause can't have any potential, because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing. So there's one unchanging cause that is purely actual. That is the thing that we call God, and it actualizes all of the other changes.
Now we're talking. The argument from change is a fascinating argument that I think doesn't get nearly enough attention in modern apologetics. Ben serves his view as well by pointing them to Ed Feser's book, which spends a marvelous 51 pages on this Aristotelian argument. Ben went over it quite quickly, so let me try to give you a bit more detail. The first premise is usually accepted as common sense. Change exists. Things change. A hot coffee becomes a cold coffee. A parked car becomes a moving car. The most subscribed atheist skeptic YouTube channel becomes the second most subscribed. But change as a concept is a bit more paradoxical than it may seem at first. Think about it. What is change? Well, according to Parmenides, a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher, change is actually impossible. When things appear to change, it can only be that, an appearance, an illusion. In reality, nothing ever actually changes at all. Okay, why on earth would he think this? Well, for change to occur, says Parmenides, there needs to be something that at one point doesn't exist and then comes into existence. Feser imagines a hot cup of coffee. The cold coffee, which it will eventually become, doesn't exist yet. It's not there. It's not anywhere. And if something doesn't exist, it's nothing. So for the coffee to become cold, something, that is the cold coffee, must come from what is currently nothing. But Parmenides draws our attention to one of philosophy's most famous observations. Ex nihilo, nihil fit. Nothing comes from nothing. Or to put it in more familiar terms, you can't get something from nothing. From nothing, nothing can come. And so if change involves something coming from nothing, then change can't actually exist and must be some kind of illusion. Or take an example from The Philosopher, a wonderful channel, by the way. My skin is white, but if I sit out in the sun, it will become red. This change in my skin color requires that redness, which currently doesn't exist, comes into existence. What is nothing must become something. But if something coming from nothing is impossible, then change must therefore be impossible too. Pretty weird, right? Well, not according to a small-time thinker from Steigerer you may have heard of, called Aristotle, who argues, contrary to Parmenides, that change doesn't involve something coming from nothing, but rather something coming from potential, which is not quite the same thing as nothing. Ed Feser imagines, once again, the hot coffee. Now, the future coldness of the coffee is not actually present right now, but it is potentially present, in that the hot coffee currently has, right now, the potential to become cold. The parked car has the potential to move forward. My channel has the potential to overtake Drew's once more, or so I like to think. Now, you may say that this is just wordplay. Sure, the coffee has the potential to become cold, but the coldness still doesn't exist. Well, sure, but consider something else that doesn't exist, like a chicken. This coffee is not cold, and it's also not a chicken. But these seem importantly different. since the coffee seems to have the potential to become cold, but it doesn't have the potential to become a chicken. The coldness and the chicken both don't exist, but the coldness seems to not exist in a different kind of way, a more substantial kind of way, because although it's not actually present, it is potentially present in a way that the chicken is not. So sure, if this hot coffee were to turn into a chicken, that would seem to be like something coming from nothing. But if the hot coffee turns into a cold coffee, it seems to be something coming from potential, which is not quite nothing, at least not in the same way as the chicken is. So, for Aristotle, change is not something coming from nothing, but rather the actualization of potential. Actualization here just means something potential becoming actual, the potentially cold coffee becoming an actually cold coffee. So the reason why this coffee can't change into a chicken is because change is the actualization of potential, and this coffee doesn't have the potential to become a chicken. So potential is a real thing that exists of objects like my coffee that's distinct from nothing at all. At least that's what Aristotle would have us believe. So the first premise of the argument that Ben's presenting is that change exists. And we might have thought from Parmenides' paradox that change can't actually exist. But maybe this paradox fails, because change doesn't actually require something to come from nothing, as Parmenides thought, because potential isn't nothing. It's a real property of my coffee, which just needs to be actualized. And that actualization of the real potential that my coffee has to become cold is what we call change. So the argument continues, change requires a changer. Potential doesn't just spontaneously actualize. It has to be actualized by something else. The potential coldness of the coffee is actualized by the coldness of the room. The potential million subscribers on this YouTube channel is actualized by you smashing that subscribe button. And don't forget the notification bell. I also have a Patreon. But crucially, only something that's already actual can actualize something else. The potential coldness of my coffee can't be actualized by, say, a really hot room that has the potential to be cold. The room has to be actually cold in order to actualize the coldness of the coffee. But this is the beginning of a regress. Why? Well, because the coldness of the coffee is actualized by the coldness of the room. But the hot room becoming a cold room is itself the actualization of potential, as is the existence of the room in the first place, since at one point this room never existed, it only potentially existed. And so the room itself required an actualizer, and whatever actualized the room requires its own actualizer, and so on and so forth. Now, if this chain goes on infinitely, we seem to have a problem. As Ben argues,
this is sort of like the old joke about the philosopher and the turtle. The philosopher is asked, what supports the earth? And he says, a turtle. And somebody says, well, what supports the turtle? And he says, another turtle. So what about that one? He says, it's turtles all the way down. The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle. There has to be one prime cause. That cause can't have any potential, because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing. So there's one unchanging cause that is purely actual. That is the thing that we call God, and it actualizes all of the other changes.
So as you can see, this is a kind of first cause argument that doesn't establish much beyond the existence of some fundamental, purely actual cause at the basis of all other actual things. Now, this might not sound like God yet to you, but a purely actual cause that sustains and actualizes everything that exists is pretty difficult to believe in and call yourself an atheist. Okay, that was maybe a bit long, but I hope you're still with me. I think it was worth really spelling out this argument. If any of the previous doesn't make sense, or you're confused about it, you can read Ed Feser's book, or simply Google the argument from change for more information. Now I want to tell you some issues that I have with it. The first problem that I have with this is treating potential as if it's a real quality of an object. To avoid thinking of change as something coming from nothing, we imagine that this hot coffee really has this thing, this potential to become cold. Potential is thought of as a real property of my coffee.
So if something is changing, it's because there was a potential for that change in the thing.
But consider this. My coffee has the potential to be lots of things. In fact, it seems to have the potential to be an infinite number of things. For example, my coffee is currently around 70 degrees Celsius, and it has the potential to cool down to 60 degrees Celsius. It also has the potential to be exactly 60.1 degrees. It has the potential to be 60.11 degrees. It has the potential to be 60.111 degrees, and so on, ad infinitum. Now, a great deal of religious philosophers and non-religious philosophers believe that actual infinites can't exist. For example, this is the basis of William Lane Craig's version of the Kalam cosmological argument. If an infinite number of things really exists, it leads to all kinds of paradoxes, perhaps most famously the paradox of Hilbert's Hotel.
The way in which Ghazali shows the impossibility of an actually infinite number of things is by imagining what it would be like if such a collection could exist, and then drawing out the absurd consequences from it.
More information is in the description. I'll link my podcast episode with William Lane Craig, one of my favorites to date, in which we talk about this in some detail. Now, it's important to distinguish between actual infinites and potential infinites. Actual infinites would be some kind of actually infinite number of things that exists all at once, whereas potential infinites are things which tend towards infinity without ever actually getting there. For example, I can halve the space between my hands, and I can halve it again, and I can halve it again, and I can halve it again, and I can keep going on ad infinitum. But because this is a process that tends towards infinity, but never actually gets there, there's no paradoxes involved. Now, if I keep on adding decimal points to the temperature of my coffee, as I did a moment ago, it may seem like we're dealing with a potential infinite that continually tends towards infinity, but never actually gets there. But remember, in order to avoid Parmenides' objections, we needed to say that all of the potential properties of this coffee are potential properties that are real, that it actually has right now. It actually has these properties, these potential properties, because otherwise, if they didn't exist, if they weren't real, they'd be nothing, and then we'd run into Parmenides' objection. But that means all of these potential temperatures that my coffee could be are potentially present in the coffee all at once, right now. This isn't something tending towards infinity as I count it out. These things are thought of as actually existing as potential properties of my coffee right now. So if we have to think of a potential property as a real thing in order to avoid something coming from nothing, then we would be positing that this coffee has an actually infinite number of properties which really exist, which seems to be impossible. A second problem is one that was raised by the atheist philosopher Graham Oppy while he was discussing this very argument with Ed Feser himself, something that you can watch on the Capturing Christianity YouTube channel. Oppy simply grants that change is the actualization of potential, but he points out that the reverse is not true. Not all actualization of potential is change. He provides the example of a chair, like the chair that I'm sat on right now. Now, this chair is yellow. This chair has the potential to become blue, say, if somebody were to reupholster it. But it also seems to have the potential to remain yellow. That is, things that are actual seem to have the potential to simply remain as they are. If they don't have this potential, then they wouldn't be able to remain as they are, and so they would stop existing. And therefore, actual things will always have at least one kind of potential, which is the potential to remain as they are. But now listen to what Ben correctly says about the first cause established by the argument from change.
There has to be one prime cause. That cause can't have any potential, because if it had potential, something else could activate it into changing. So there's one unchanging cause that is purely actual.
The God that Ben is talking about has to be something that has no potential whatsoever. But as I've just argued, unless God is about to stop existing, he must have at least one kind of potential, which is the potential to remain as he is, to remain in existence. So the purely actual God with no potential that Ben thinks he's proven may not actually be able to exist at all. Finally, my third objection is that the argument from change may only work on an A theory of time. The A theory of time posits that the present is all that exists. The past and the future, in other words, don't exist. There's just the present. The B theory of time, on the other hand, posits that the past and the future both exist just like the present does, and that they all exist in one big time block. It can be a little bit weird to get your head around, but on the B theory of time, it's often suggested that objects, as well as having 3 spatial dimensions, also have a 4th temporal dimension that stretches across this time block. Of course, we're only able to see one point of this dimension, but the past cup and the future cup both exist just like the present one does. The only thing that makes this part of the cup, the present cup, is that the person calling it the present cup occupies the same place on the time block as this particular part of the cup. So on this view, you are, right now, looking at a different part of the cup than you were a moment ago, because the cup has a real, unobservable, but real dimension that stretches through time, and what you think of as the present cup and the future cup are actually just different parts of this same cup along that temporal dimension. Thus, the potential cup, the cold cup, and the actual cup, the hot cup, are actually just the same cup, and these words merely describe different points along this temporal dimension. But all of these points exist, all in the same way, and if you were able to step outside of the time block, you'd see them all at once. If this is the case, then calling something potential simply because it exists at a different point on the time block to me, and actual when it exists at the same point, would be like me calling the coffee potential because it was in a different room in the house where I can't see it, and actual when it happens to be in front of me. This is a misleading description of what's actually going on. So if the potential coffee and the actual coffee are actually both just different parts of the same coffee that you could see as one big block if you were outside of time, then the distinction between potential and actual is no longer a property of the coffee, but a property of the observer, and which point of the coffee's temporal dimension they happen to be looking at. Now, if this is the case, if this is an accurate description of reality, then if we were to look from outside of time, we'd see that there's no such thing as real change, because the past, the present, and the future cup would all simply exist all at once in front of us on this time block. For what it's worth, Ed Feser actually discusses this very objection, and specifically the view that Einstein's relativity theory points to a B theory rather than an A theory of time. So there are 3 objections to Ben's argument to consider. First, the problem of an actually infinite number of potential properties, if potential properties are real things that are predicated of an object. Secondly, the problem of the purely actual actualizer, in fact, at least having one kind of potential, the potential to remain as it is. And thirdly, the problems raised for the argument by adopting a B theory of time, making change itself something of an illusion. It is also worth briefly noting that so far I've basically just agreed to Ben's earlier claim that there just can't be an infinite regress of potential things being actualized.
The infinite regress argument is just not convincing. There has to be something underlying the final turtle.
I'm inclined to think that it would be really weird if there were such an infinite regress, but Aristotle himself actually took this view. Of course, to believe as he did in an infinite temporal regress requires belief in an infinite past, which has its problems and paradoxes. And Feser's discussion of an atemporal hierarchical chain of causation seem like they can't actually be infinite, for compelling reasons that he discusses in the book. But of course, if there is an infinite regress of actualization of potential, this would count as a 4th objection to the argument. It's just not one that I would want to defend. Now, as I've already said, I think that the argument from change is brilliant and fascinating and compelling. Sure, I have objections that I've just spoken about, but these might be easily answered, for all I know, by a philosopher of someone like Ed Feser's caliber. But even if my objections can be answered, it seems to me that Ben's suggestion that atheism is a delusion because of the argument from change, among other things, is, shall we say, hyperbolic at best. Now Ben's video gets a bit more scientific, which isn't exactly my area. I really wanted to just talk about the argument from change here as the main part of the video, but I don't want to seem like I'm ignoring anything, so let's briefly watch through the rest of the video, and I'll offer some passing comments, but best refer to a scientist for something more substantial on the following points.
Now, atheists frequently suggest that science has killed God. But as we've seen, science itself requires certain presuppositions outside of science. As mathematician Gödel stated, any internally consistent system of mathematical axioms cannot be completely comprehensive. There must be assumptions made outside the system.
I'm pretty sure that Gödel's incompleteness theorem just tells us that any axiomatic system, a mathematical system, can never prove every true statement that can be made in that axiomatic language. In other words, it tells us that there might be true statements that, despite being true, are impossible to prove. As Marcus de Sautoy puts it,
at its heart, it says there might be conjectures out there about numbers, for example, something like Goldbach's conjecture, which might actually be true. So it might be true that every even number is the sum of two primes, but maybe within the axiomatic system we have for mathematics, there isn't a proof of that. The real worry is, what if there's a true statement that I'm working away on which actually doesn't have a proof?
So Gödel's theorem shows us that there will be things described by our system that our system can't prove. And so epistemically, we need to make assumptions outside of the system. But that just tells us about what we can prove, not about the actual nature of the things being proven. As de Sautoy says,
but Gödel showed that actually there's a gap between truth and proof.
But again, this really isn't my area, nor is it Ben's. Go and ask a mathematician.
Atheists claim that the evolutionary process relieved the need for God. After all, if God wasn't directing the process of the creation of human beings in the literalistic interpretation of the biblical creation story, who needed God? The problem, of course, is that evolution is an extraordinarily complex process that does not forestall the possibility of a directing hand.
Well, no, evolution itself doesn't disprove God or preclude his existence, but I think it's misleading to suggest that it was ever supposed to. Sure, evolution causes problems for belief in God's existence, but only in specific ways. For example, it invalidates the argument for God's existence from biological complexity. It also raises questions about why a process involving so much suffering was the one used by God, and what could make human beings special if we're all connected on one evolutionary tree. These are interesting problems for theism, caused by evolution by natural selection, but of course they don't disprove God's existence altogether. They're just important considerations against it.
Stephen Meyer, an intelligent design advocate, points out that the transmission of information via cellular processes looks an awful lot like an intelligent creator transmitting information. Our experience of the world shows that what we recognize as information invariably reflects the prior activity of conscious and intelligent persons. What then should we make of the presence of information in living organisms?
Of course, one of the great beauties of evolutionary biology is its ability to explain exactly why certain natural phenomena have the appearance of design. Its genius is in showing how ordered complexity can emerge from random fundamental processes. But on this point of information transmission specifically, I can certainly do no better than deferring to Genetically Modified Skeptics' video, since he enlisted the help of John Perry from Stated Clearly, and I will simply never be able to speak more competently than him on biology. Links in the description.
The biggest scientific problem for atheists lies in the nature of the universe itself. The Big Bang is the theory that holds that the universe began with the explosion outward of a high-density pinpoint of matter, which sounds an awful lot like the creation story at the beginning of the Bible.
How does an entire universe full of energy simply appear out of nothing?
The original skepticism of the Big Bang theory was driven in large measure by objections to that similarity, the very specific conditions under which our universe was created that allowed for the development of intelligent human life are often used by believers as proof of God's hand. The so-called fine-tuning of the universe for life is extraordinary. If, for example, the strength of the Big Bang had differed by 1 part in 10 to the 60th power, the universe just would not exist the way that it does right now.
If the deistic God thought all that through and set up the laws of physics, then he would have to be damn clever.
Atheists claim that just because you won the lottery doesn't mean that you won because somebody intended for you to win the lottery. Somebody had to win. But that doesn't answer the question. If you kept winning the lottery over and over and over and over again, billions of times, at some point, you might suppose that somebody was cheating.
Okay, I've discussed and debated the fine-tuning argument before, but Ben seems to have chosen the most dubious response to it and said that this is what atheists claim. Specifically, the idea that the fine-tuning of the constants is actually random and we just got lucky. The only time that this kind of response is really taken seriously is when it's presented in the context of a multiverse. Of course, if there's only one universe and the constants of gravity, expansion rate, strong and weak nuclear forces, etc., could have actually been anything, and just happened by chance to be perfect for a life-permitting universe, this chance would be so infinitesimally small that I couldn't even take it seriously. But two problems. First, it may be that if the constants differed even slightly, then the universe as we know it couldn't exist. But it's a different claim to say that they could have differed even slightly. So one line of argument suggests that the constants had to be of the values that they have, perhaps because of some undiscovered underlying law, or perhaps because they're all, in fact, expressions of the same law. And we may need to still explain that law, of course, but at least there would only be one thing to explain, not a multitude of constants. But more commonly, it's suggested that if there's more than one universe, then if they all have a random assortment of constant values, chances are at least one of them will get lucky, as it were. Ben says that it's more like getting lucky over and over and over again, which is true. I mean, the chances are tiny. But if the number of universes is infinite or near infinite, then we can guarantee that such an outcome would happen at least once. Of course, I want to resist invoking a multiverse as a kind of disposal problem for the fine-tuning argument. I think we should only seriously consider it as an option if we have independent reason to think that such a multiverse exists, and not just consider it as an ad hoc means of getting out of the fine-tuning argument. There's a lot more to say about this argument, but I've discussed it before, and doubtless will do again. I'll put links in the description that might be relevant. But look, it's a good argument. I won't deny that. There are lots of good arguments for God's existence, and I hope you don't expect me to treat every single argument presented as if it's complete trash just because I'm an atheist and I'm trying to make a video. But again, I would hardly consider the matter settled, at least as settled as Ben seems to think that it is.
Then there's the question of human consciousness.
Why are we conscious? Right now, nobody knows the answers.
Scientists have presented many theories about it, but none has been sufficient to explain how consciousness arises out of the physical processes of the brain. Physicist Roger Penrose explains, quote, "We need a major revolution in our understanding of the physical world in order to accommodate consciousness." Even Richard Dawkins admits that the development of consciousness is, quote, "to me, the most profound mystery facing modern biology."
Ben quotes Penrose and Dawkins here, both non-believers by the way, as saying that consciousness is a great mystery that science is yet to explain. But just like earlier, where Ben would bring up a problem of science or philosophy and say that atheism fails to account for it, he himself simply fails to show why God would help us to do so. And maybe God's existence can help us explain the mystery of consciousness. But Ben's provided no argument, nor even hinted at an argument, that this is the case. And perhaps worse still, by using these quotes, Ben seems to be suggesting that because we have a phenomenon which science has, at least as of yet, failed to comprehensively explain, we ought to resort to theism, which is the definition of a God of the gaps argument. So I'm not so sure about that one either. Now, in the rest of this video, Ben makes just two more points. First, that the problem of evil doesn't disprove God's existence entirely. And second, that religious people doing bad things shouldn't make us think that God doesn't exist. I agree with both of these claims, more or less, but I'm just not going to get into the problem of evil here. I just released an hour-long podcast on the topic and have debated it, frankly, ad nauseum. So you can get my thoughts from those past videos and discussions if you're interested. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of our sweeping journey through reason, free will, morality, change, Parmenides and Aristotle, Ed Feser and Graham Oppy, theories of time, and the limits of mathematics. Who'd have thought all of this could come from a Ben Shapiro video? I've had a great time making this one, and if you do enjoy my content, please consider becoming a financial supporter at patreon.com/cosmic skeptic. And special thanks as always to my top tier patrons for keeping this channel afloat. I've been Alex O'Connor. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.